Hello, this is Clive Priddle, and this is The Current. Current was conceived as an idea that would bring really experienced, wise authors with great understanding to talk about the most difficult, complicated, challenging, and unprecedented events of the day. And today we are talking about Wednesday, the 6th of January, 2021, which is, in everybody's agreement, an unprecedented day in American history. And I'm going to talk about this in a very careful and neutral way because I want the people who we're going to hear from to talk about it in a much more colorful and dramatic way as they think appropriate. Wednesday, the 6th of January, is, of course, when a large crowd of people, having listened to Donald Trump, marched up Pennsylvania Avenue, broke through the barricades around the U.S. Capitol, forcibly entered the Capitol building, suspending the counting of the electoral votes in the election, the presidential election, damaging much of the interior of the building, and leading to 2 deaths, one of a Capitol police officer, one of the members of the crowd, and 3 deaths, as far as we know, of people in the outside area of the congregation. So it was an extraordinary day. And we're very lucky on The Current to have 3 informed and insightful authors who've agreed to talk about this day, its significance, what perhaps it portends. So I'm delighted to introduce David Rothkopf and Keith Boykin and Elizabeth Becker. David is the CEO of the Rothkopf Group, which hosts the Deep State Radio podcast. He's also most recently the author of Traitor, A History of Betraying America, from Benedict Arnold to Donald Trump, a book that I imagine in its paperback edition may have a few updates. Keith Boykin is a CNN political commentator, a best-selling author, and the forthcoming author of a book on the bold type list called Race Against Time. Elizabeth Becker is an award-winning journalist and author who began her career as a war correspondent for the Washington Post. She's also worked for National Public Radio and the New York Times. She has seen her fair share of coups, though I suspect this is the first one that she's seen from the porch of her own home in Washington, D.C. So welcome, all of you. I wanted to ask you first, and perhaps we're going to start with you, David, and end up with Elizabeth. When you look back on the 6th of January, is there going to be an abiding image or an abiding moment in that cascade of images that we've all been teasing through that is going to just sear into your mind, that's going to be the one that sticks?
I don't know. I was in a kind of welter of disbelief and growing anger and a kind of low-grade nausea throughout most of the day as I watched what was happening. It was one thing to see large crowds listening to Trump, another to see them marching up the street towards the Capitol or standing on the steps. I guess when those crowds began to break into the Capitol, when it was clear that they were walking through the Capitol with complete disregard for its traditions and menacing in many ways. And then you saw pictures of them sitting in the speaker's office, sitting in the chambers, carrying Confederate flags through the statuary hall. I guess those images stay with me the most because it was at that moment you realized we had lost control of the Capitol building, that we were moments away from a mass casualty event, that the business of the Senate and of the House had, as Trump had intended it, been interrupted, that the business of democracy of the country was being violently stopped at the instigation of the President of the United States with the help of some unprincipled senators and congressmen. Those images will linger a long time. And I don't think, I think they'll be shown to people for decades to come.
Keith, was there a moment for you?
I share David's sort of imagery of the moments with the Confederate flag, but the one moment that most stuck with me didn't take place inside the Capitol. It was actually on the steps of the Capitol. As a Capitol police officer or someone, law enforcement, was helping a Trump supporter or insurrectionist white woman down the stairs, holding her hand down the stairs to make sure she didn't hurt herself after she had tried to violently take over the United States government. And it was so infuriating for me, particularly because, as you know, Clive, last summer I was arrested by the police, not even as a participant in a demonstration, but as a journalist who was covering a Black Lives Matter protest. And to see the disparity in the treatment, the way that this woman was treated compared to the way that I was treated, it angered me. I couldn't think of any other word to describe it. It just really, really angered me. I felt as though I've been saying this, and many of us have been saying this for a long time about the racial disparities in this country. And then here it was for anyone to see. If you compared the way that the protesters were being treated with the way that I was treated, the way that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated, it was just shocking. And I just hope that Americans saw that and that it actually registered people and they understood why it was important to notice that difference.
Elizabeth, you were perhaps the only one who was watching out of your window to some of these events as opposed to the rest of us, I think, who were probably watching on TV or online. What's going to stick for you?
Well, I'm not going to shy away from the word terrorist. That's the first word that came into my mind when I saw them. First, I saw them on TV like everyone else, and then I went out to try to watch what they were doing. And I live 3 blocks from the Capitol. Those Capitol police don't let me and my dog near half of those places. We see regularly policemen with AK-47, M16s, anyway, automatic rifles on the steps. And all of a sudden, they're just walking across the little fences. They're walking across everything that had been set up for the inauguration. And as Keith just said, it seemed like the doors were opening for them. And then the District of Columbia Police came to our block because we're so close and we were put in lockdown. And as I told Clive in an email, across the street, I saw from my window a little robot come pick up an explosive device and take it away, and they later defused it. This was a terrorist attack, and my lasting image from the TV, because the police wisely told us all to stay in the house, was the protesters crawling up the outside. This is what I couldn't believe. I know that it was shocking because we've all covered, or in David's case, been part of the administration as well. But we've all been in Congress as reporters sitting in the balcony. But to see them climbing up the outside walls on the Western Front, my husband is a retired U.S. Army general. And he said, this is not possible. This is not possible. This is studied neglect. This is not benign neglect. It's studied neglect. This cannot happen. There are too many. And then, of course, the ones who were arrested, 14? I think Political said this morning, that's how many were arrested at an average New York professional football game. The ones who were arrested were by our wonderful Mayor Muriel Bowser, who has gone up in my estimation, because at least she called a curfew and they could arrest him for curfew. I mean, that's how this is. You cannot, those of us who live, work, and cover this city and the government, this is beyond belief. I welcome the investigations.
Elizabeth, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
The device that was on your block, was that related to the pipe bomb that was found by the DNC?
Yeah, mine was the one founded by the RNC.
Oh, the RNC. Okay.
Because the RNC is right at we're half a block from the corner of the RNC. We share a corner with the RNC.
Okay.
So the DNC was 2 blocks away, and this was just across the street. So yes.
Wow.
So I want to talk some more about the whole policing of this event, because a lot of people are wondering what on earth happened. I have to say, when I was thinking about it afterwards, I remember what it was like in New York in 2004 when there was war in the Gulf, and pretty much more than 6 people gathered together were liable for arrest and being yanked off and taken to the tombs for the night. There was no gathering of crowds at all allowed. There was no protesting of George W. Bush's policies, even though they were very controversial, especially here in New York City. And I think a lot of us felt that the restriction on the freedom to protest was a terrible overreaction of those times. So to some extent, seeing protesters back on the street is perhaps what we want to see. But how is it that we not only allowed protesters back on the street here, we allowed them to be on the street with knives and batons and clubs. And as you say, they didn't seem to face much of an obstacle in their walk from the rally to the Capitol. Any idea what happened there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what happened there was that the plan succeeded. The President of the United States and those around the President of the United States had been planning this event for over a month. There was, merchandise printed up. The President on December 19th was saying he watched on January 6th when all of this happened. The Proud Boys came and visited the White House in the midst of that period of time. There were all sorts of conversations going on. And, Elizabeth is absolutely right. This doesn't happen unless it's intentional. I mean, Keith is right. There's an undercurrent of traditional American institutional racism here. But it was that racism that fueled that crowd to begin with, that fueled that president to begin with. And he has ridden his career on the back of that racism. And there were cops in the Capitol, and there were people who managed the National Guard elsewhere, and there were people who managed the people who should have been putting their arms around this, who subscribed to that racism. And the result was, for political reasons, for racist reasons, we ended up with the doors being thrown wide open to a bunch of white supremacists who wanted to stop democracy and steal the votes of, effectively the people of Pennsylvania and Georgia and a bunch of other places, notably the black votes, notably the votes of people of color. That's what they were there to do. They were there to do the unfinished business of the post-Civil War period and take the votes away from black people again.
I'm glad David mentioned that, because there's been a lot of talk about the parallels between what took place this week and what took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when a biracial fusion government was elected, and the white people of that community were so outraged by it that they burned down the city and took over the government and dethroned or removed the elected officials, because they couldn't tolerate the idea of having African American people in charge of their local government. I think what is so disturbing about this is that there are people who still continue to support the actions of the president and believe that they're patriots for doing so. Abraham Lincoln famously said he called Americans to the better angels of our nature. I believe it was the second inaugural address when he said that. But it feels to me that Donald Trump has consistently called us to the worst demons of our disposition. At every opportunity, he's failed the test of trying to unite the country. This country has been divided since the beginning, and has been divided on the issue of race since the beginning, to be blunt about it. And every president, Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, black or white, has understood that the country was held together on a very sort of tenuous rope, if you will. And in order to maintain that, we had to do something to try to at least pretend that we were all unified. And this is the first president I think I've seen in my lifetime who hasn't made any effort to even pretend that that's important. He's made no effort to try to reach out to people who disagree with them. And so the possibility of civil war, which is something a lot of people have been warning about for the past 4 years, has never seemed more imminent than it did this week. And it scares me because I don't think this is the end.
So I want to ask you a bit more about that, and maybe Elizabeth, you could offer some insight onto this too. So some of the pictures of the protesters did not look like civil warriors. They looked like a guy who was auditioning to be an extra on the Game of Thrones, and then another guy who thinks it's funny to steal a podium. I don't think there's a big resale market in podiums. And all these people are taking selfies of themselves, which merely guarantees them a rather complicated, criminal phase in their lives. I mean, is this really organized, intentional behavior, or is it incoherent, random emotional outpourings?
Well, Clive, they are terrorists by political and legal definition. Just because they're incompetent brutes doesn't mean they aren't treasonous. They're traitors. They gathered together, attacked our political citadel, and threatened our officials. So I don't care if they all look like Crispy the Clown. That's irrelevant. At what they did, what they said, and what they said their motivations were. They were openly racist. There was no doubt about it. And I want to say something about your comment about protests. I mean, all of us gathered here in one way or another depend on the First Amendment for our livelihoods, right? And we have been drilled on what those First Amendments are and what those rights are and what the bumpers are. Calling fire in the middle of a movie theater is the first thing you learn. That's not protected by the First Amendment. So yes, they can protest. We like them protest, but, and also to add to what Keith said, how they are policed when they protest is very important. So you had this classic, it will be a textbook demonstration of how a demagogue can use the cloth of First Amendment, the cloth of patriotism, to push an insurrection. And I think particularly as writers and journalists, we have to be distinguished deeply and effectively what is protected on the First Amendment, what isn't. And this goes to the second point. There's a good reason why he kept calling us fake news, because that's our job. He wanted his whole ecosystem to be protected against people like us, journalists, writers, who are committed to telling the truth, no matter whether we like it or not. So, voila.
Can I just throw something in there? Because there's an image here that Elizabeth has evoked that I think is useful to everybody to take away. Because we talk about First Amendment rights and we ask ourselves, where do they end? Well, in this particular case, in this particular demonstration, you know exactly where they ended. They ended at the legal boundary of the Capitol. They ended when they crossed the boundary, broke the law, and began to undo the legal way that our government works. But there was a place. If they were staying where they had a license to say all the hateful things they said, that was fine. As they marched up the street, maybe they're in a gray area in terms of civil ordinances of the city of Washington, D.C. But when they crossed the line and started breaking windows and rampaging through the Capitol, they lost that right. And it's useful. I just think you evoked the useful imagery of the boundaries of free speech.
I agree with everything that's been said. I just wonder, I blame the protesters and the rioters for their behavior, but I think I largely blame Donald Trump more than anyone else, because he is the one who started, he is the one who had the responsibility to stop this. he's the one who could have prevented this from the beginning. It reminds me again of the way he handled the coronavirus pandemic or failed to handle the pandemic. And the reason why we have people who are fighting about wearing masks in this country is because we haven't had any leadership from the President of the United States. And the idea, again, to bring this question back for me to the issue of race, the idea that Barack Obama or a black president could have done this, could have governed any that Donald Trump has, is inconceivable.
Yep.
People are letting him do it. 4 million people voted for him.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, also you had the juxtaposition with the Kenosha verdict, which came by that. So the day before this all happened, a cop was found, innocent of crime. There was the decision not to prosecute took place of a young black man who he had in his grasp, who he shot 7 times in the back, and yet, so in that particular case, the innocent person was violently punished for the racism of the cop, and here you had a white mob rampaging with the assistance of the police through the Capitol.
I agree with Keith very much. Obviously, this was a Donald Trump incited riot, insurrection, and it began. We all have our different dates. Some people say it's Charlottesville when it became clear. I mean, I think in a way, again, because I live in D.C., that first week when everybody went to the airport because he had declared this illegal ban on Muslims. I mean, that's when everybody's, oh my God, everybody says you can't do anything. He's going to do anything he wants to do. That's all true. And but as someone who's had to write about another evil genius and pick apart how he did it, Pol Pot, in Cambodia, it became clear to me at the beginning, I can't just call him an evil genius. I can't call him a madman. I have to look at the history of this country. I have to look how it came about, what all of the pieces are. And that's something Americans are really, really reluctant to do. It's easy for us to examine another country, Banana Republic, that came across the last couple of days. But how easy is it going to be for us as writers and reporters, much less as citizens, to do that? And the one thing that encourages me was Georgia. Yay, Georgia, where you saw an engagement on a level I can't remember, where you had citizens involved so much. And it was an entirely different kind of election. So this is not the beginning or the end. We have to dig deep. He's a very brilliant demagogue.
So we've already talked a little bit about Donald Trump, but he has, as of today, when we're having this conversation, he's got a dozen more days in office, and it seems unlikely that there is going to be an effective constitutional challenge to him. It seems unlikely that impeachment is going to happen in time, were that course to be taken. Is there any way to, as it were, neutralize a president gone rogue? Because that feels like everybody would really like to know that right now. Does he have to remain the commander-in-chief? There's this extraordinary letter that was signed by 10 former defense secretaries earlier in this week. Again, part of the prologue to this riot was that letter in the Washington Post from 10 former defense secretaries telling the army not to interfere in the official process of ratifying the election. It almost feels as though there are people out there who want to detach the commander-in-chief from his forces. Is there anything like this legally possible? Has anything like this happened before?
Well, as we are recording this, I don't want to admit to have been looking at Twitter, but it might have been. And Nancy Pelosi put out a press release saying that she had spoken to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to ensure that an unstable president was not able to launch an attack or do damage, which is absolutely extraordinary, totally outside the chain of command, by the way, not supposed to happen. And I think what we need to take away from that is not just the next 12 days are full of peril, and that the president of the United States has enormous power. If the president of the United States decides he wants to launch nuclear weapons, there are 5 minutes between him making that decision and it happening.
But he can't get on Facebook.
Well, maybe. That has to do more with the Georgia election and Mark Zuckerberg's realization that the Democrats are going to be writing his regulation from now on than it does with any sense of conscience on the part of Mark Zuckerberg. But the point is, I think the past 4 years have shown that the guardrails and checks and balances in our system are defective. And one of the reasons is that they are defective is that no one thought this could happen, and that some president would be so outside the norms, so serially criminal, that you needed stronger guardrails, checks, and balances. And then that is compounded by the fact that our Constitution is profoundly flawed, and it gives disproportionate power to the minority, and that power is going to grow. And if that minority is afraid of the demographic trends in this country as they are going to use every tool in the book as they have to cling to power as they have. And our system is broken. It's not just Donald Trump, because our system should have said, oh, he's a criminal. It should have said, let's look at his taxes because he's broken the law. It should have said, here's 11 counts of obstruction of justice. Let's throw him in the slammer. It should have said, stop him here, 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 and here. And it didn't. And that's why we got to here. It's not just Donald Trump. It's every flaw and every enabler in the system over the course of multiple years that has led us here. And I hope that we come out of this. And by the way, you're right to focus. I'll stop here, but you're right to focus on January 6th. Because for 4 years, we've seen democracy attacked, but it's been theoretical for most people. And on January 6th, you saw people climbing up the Capitol, breaking windows, and tearing at the fabric of democracy. And they didn't need, Tom Friedman or David Ignatius for somebody to say, this is a problem. It was like, holy shit. Our democracy is coming apart at the seams. And so hopefully we're going to respond to that, not by saying, oh, let's get on with business. Let's start our healing. But with identifying how this happened, investigating, prosecuting, and holding people accountable. Because the problem is there are no checks and balances. Accountability is the most important check.
David, I want to thank you for making a plug for my next book, Racing Time, The Politics of America.
Isn't that why we're here?
You basically outlined my argument in your speech there. I appreciate that. I just want to add to what you said that this is not about my book, but I think that I too saw the article about Nancy Pelosi right before I got on the interview today, the discussion today. And what struck me about it was not that she had to make that call, but that she actually has no constitutional authority to do anything about this. So she can make all the calls she wants, but Donald Trump still has the constitutional authority to launch nuclear weapons, regardless of the fact that the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader of the American people may not want him to. That is a fundamental problem. And it speaks to the issue that you also addressed, which is that we are governed by an 18th century document in a 21st century democracy. It makes no sense. It's time for us to reevaluate our founding principles and our founding instruments and to reconfigure them in a way that works for who we are as a modern democracy, which we haven't done. We have to be able to rein in future potential dictators. We have to be able to understand that we have armies now that don't take months to marshal as they did in 1780, but they could be, as you said, our forces could be launched in minutes. And we have to reconsider how we structure that power. Congress has to be a more active participant in that. The idea, I think it was James Madison, the Federalist Papers, an ambition would counteract ambition. That hasn't happened.
No.
What I see is ambition has facilitated ambition.
Yeah.
Like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz are facilitating Donald Trump's ambition. Counteracting the ambition of the executive branch from the Republican Party. So we really need to rethink the way we govern ourselves as a country.
Well, and to circle back to the events on January 6th itself, one of the reasons it took so long for the police to come is exactly that constitutional problem. We in the District of Columbia have no voice. The mayor tried to get more troops. Donald Trump wouldn't listen to her. Members of Congress hiding in their rooms had to call the governor of Maryland and the governor of Virginia. They tried to get permission and it went back. When the mayor had her first press conference, she said, first 100 days, we've got to become a state. We have to be able to call in our National Guard like any place else. This is a small example of exactly the problem you're talking about.
Let me thank you all for what has been a really brilliant and illuminating conversation. And I want to ask you one more question and maybe use this as the one to go out on. And it was, I think, Van Jones who dangled it yesterday. So the 6th of January, 2021 could be seen as the end of something. It could be, the last spasms of Trump, the death throes of this presidency thrashing around before it finally expires. Or it could be that January the 6th is the beginning of something, that it makes public, it makes real something that until then, as you kind of said, David, was perhaps a theory, that there could be tremendous damage in this set of ideas. Suddenly it becomes real. It becomes actionable. It happens. I want to ask each of you whether you think it's the beginning or the end.
Well, I guess it just popped in my mind this Winston Churchill quote that everyone knows. This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's not the end. It's not the. I've now forgotten the quote. It's not. It's not the end. It's not the. But it is the end of the beginning. That's what it is. It's not the end. It's not the beginning of the end. But it is the end of the beginning. And obviously, it just popped in my head. And I don't think that this is the end of anything. I don't think it's the beginning of anything. I think we're in a middle point. That's what I was trying to say. This has been going on, as I've said before, since the beginning of the country. I don't think Donald Trump is an aberration in that respect. I think he is an extension, a logical extension of all the forces, the culmination of everything else that happened before. But I don't see how this ends just because we elect and inaugurate Joe Biden as president. I don't think that those 74 million people just disappeared on January 20th and decide that they're going to peacefully accept everything for the next 4 years. And again, I believe the fundamental issue is the question of race. And what I make all the time is that ever since the announcement that white America would no longer be the majority in 2044, there's a lot of people who've been very upset about that. And they became more upset about that when Barack Obama, a black man, was elected president. They became even more upset when Hillary Clinton got more votes. A woman got more votes than the white supremacist, white nationalists who they wanted to replace her. They became more upset with all the different changes that are taking place in the country, having a black woman as vice president, having marriage equality in 50 states, having women have the right to choose how to control their own body. All the things that undermine white patriarchal hegemony are a threat to that social structure are the reasons that are inspiring, empowering people to act. And those things aren't going to change just because of January 20th. So I expect we're going to see more for many decades to come unless we make some fundamental changes in how we govern ourselves as a country.
Okay, I'm going to match your Winston Churchill with one glorious dynam. Just before January 6th, and which includes before the Georgia election, and they said, "Are you really worried? They want to take away women's control of their body. The sexism was unbelievable of this administration. Aren't you worried?" She said, "No, they're flipping out." And I'm paraphrasing you, Gloria, forgive me. But she said, whenever, and she's been pushing, her whole life as an activist, she's expecting it. It's going to keep happening. It's a continuation. This might be a culmination of one era, but the whole movement of all the things you just mentioned, Keith, are going to have a backlash. So she says, You prepare for the backlash. You organize for the backlash. You keep going. That's Gloria's. That's her inspiration for now.
I think it may be the end of one thing, and that's the political viability of Donald Trump. And I think the day before, there were a lot of people who said Trump's going to run the party in 2024. He's the guy. I don't think so. I think the Trump brand has been damaged. But I think Keith's point is the central point. We worry about the next 12 days. Don't worry about the next 12 days. Worry about the next 24 years. Worry about this period of demographic transition in the United States. Because the reason Donald Trump is here is because of that transition and the discomfort with the male white majority in the United States who've had their way for 240 years in this country, and that is going to end because of demographic reasons. The problem is made worse by the fact that by 2030, 70 votes in the Senate are going to be chosen by 30% of the people. That the way this antiquated document, to which Keith referred earlier, works is that essentially the whitest, least tolerant states are going to have twice the power, then twice the people in the more diverse states. And that tension between demographic change and disproportionate power for the few in our system is a formula for national disaster. I'll end it with one hopeful note. on the morning of January 6th, we found out that Reverend Raphael Warnock was going to become the first black senator in the Democratic Party from the South, and that Ossoff, was the son of Jewish immigrants, was going to become a senator, because Stacey Abrams had worked for 9 years in Georgia to reflect these changes, and there is a path to adjusting to this new demographic and political reality, and she's laying out that path. And so I'm hopeful, but there's going to be a lot of tension between forces like her and the ones that don't want to give it up.
Elizabeth Becker, Keith Boykin, David Rothkopf, thank you so much. Really thank you for your time today. You were totally brilliant. It's been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hachette,